Virgin girl marries a cold, paralyzed CEO, but he falls obsessed after one night. The wedding cake was still on the table. 3 tiers, white fondant roses, a little sugar bride and groom on top, both standing, both smiling, which felt to Kimberly like the cruelest joke anyone had ever played on her. She sat at the edge of the hotel suite's king-sized bed, still in her dress, ivory silk, off-shoulder, with a row of tiny pearl buttons running down her spine that her maid of honor had spent 40 minutes fastening and that no one had touched since. Her bouquet, white peonies and baby's breath, lay abandoned on the armchair by the window, already beginning to droop. She had been married for 4 hours. She had spoken to her husband for a total of 11 minutes. She was counting. Across the suite, Richard Blackwell sat near the floor-to-ceiling window in his wheelchair, his back to her, with a glass of scotch balanced on the armrest, his gaze fixed on the Manhattan skyline like it owed him something. He hadn't removed his tuxedo jacket. He hadn't loosened his tie. He looked, if anything, more composed than he had at the altar, which was saying something, because at the altar he had looked at her exactly once, signed the marriage certificate with the same expression a man uses to sign a quarterly report, and then turned away. He hadn't looked at her since. On the city glittered below them, 42 floors of indifferent light, and Kimberly thought, not for the first time tonight, what did I do? She knew the answer, of course. She had done it for her father. Daniel Moore had made her promise with an oxygen mask on his face, in tears drying at his temples and both her hands wrapped around his. The Blackwells will take care of you, sweetheart. Richard is a good man. He just forgot how. She had laughed at that, even through her crying, and because her father had always had a talent for making the unbearable sound almost gentle. He had passed 6 days later. She had walked down the aisle 9 weeks after that, and now she was sitting in a $12,000 a night honeymoon suite, listening to the ice shift in her husband's scotch glass, and trying to remember how to breathe like a person who had made a reasonable life decision. You don't have to sit there, Richard said. His voice startled her. Low, unhurried, or directed at the window rather than at her. She hadn't realized he knew she was watching him. I'm sorry, she said. There's a second bedroom. He lifted his glass, took a slow sip. Through that door on the left, it was prepared for you. For you, not for us. Not even if you'd like. Just for you, like she was a house guest he'd been obligated to accommodate. Kimberly looked at the door he'd indicated. Then she looked back at him, at the clean, unbending line of his shoulders, the sharp cut of his profile when he finally turned slightly, not quite enough to face her. Richard Blackwell was 34 years old and had once been described by Forbes as the most dangerous mind in American real estate. He was also, objectively, the most beautiful man she had ever stood beside, which she resented because it made all of this so much harder to be sensible about. Dark hair, a jaw that looked like an architect had drawn it, and eyes so pale a gray they almost looked silver in certain light. Which was fine, she told herself. That was fine. Lots of people had symmetrical faces. It didn't mean anything. What it meant was that standing at the altar next to him had felt like standing next to a closed museum, magnificent and completely off limits. I know about the second bedroom, she said quietly. I helped your assistant plan the suite. A pause, almost imperceptible. Then you know where it is. She should have gone. Boy, she knew that. The smart thing, the self-preserving thing, was to take her bruised feelings and her drooping peonies and her 40 buttons dress into that second bedroom and close the door and cry as quietly as possible and wake up tomorrow as a woman who had a plan. Instead, she heard herself say, my father thought you were a good man. The words landed in the room and neither of them moved. Richard was very still for a moment. Then he turned, slowly, when the wheelchair almost silent on the marble floor, and for the first time all evening, he looked at her. Really looked. His pale eyes moved across her face with an expression she couldn't read, something complicated behind the composure. There and then gone. Your father, he said carefully, was a man who wanted his daughter taken care of. That's not an answer. No, he agreed, it isn't. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned back to the window. lifted his scotch, and in the conversation, such as it was, appeared to be over. Kimberly stood up. She was still trembling slightly, though she was choosing to blame the air conditioning. She crossed the room slowly, not toward the second bedroom, but toward the window, stopping a careful distance away, close enough to feel the strange gravity of him, but far enough to maintain what was left of her dignity. The skyline stretched out below them, endless and indifferent. I'm not going to make this difficult, she said softly, to the glass more than to him. I know what this arrangement is. I know what you lost, what the accident took. I know you didn't choose me. She paused. I just thought you should know that I'm not afraid of you, in case you were using that. She felt him look at her again. She didn't turn. Using what? He said. The coldness. She finally glanced at him, just briefly. Oh, and she could have sworn. Something flickered in his expression. Something raw and quickly buried. Some people use it to keep people from getting too close. Silence. Then quietly, go to sleep, Kimberly. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even dismissive exactly. It was something stranger, something that almost sounded underneath the control like a warning. She went to the second bedroom. She lay in the dark in her wedding dress because she couldn't reach the buttons. And through the wall, she was almost certain she could hear him still sitting there. Not sleeping, not moving, just watching the city like a man who had forgotten that any of it belonged to him. She had married a man who was slowly disappearing into himself. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know yet, was that no one had made Richard Blackwell feel anything in 2 years. Until tonight, until her. Kimberly had always been a morning person. Not in the aggressively cheerful way. Not the kind of person who bounded out of bed with a playlist and a green smoothie and opinions about gratitude journaling. She was a morning person in the quieter sense. The kind who woke before her alarm, lay still for a few minutes listening to the city shift from night to day, and used those first soft minutes to remind herself who she was before the world got loud. She needed those minutes more than usual the morning after her wedding. She lay in the second bedroom of the Blackwell suite, her bedroom apparently permanently, staring at a ceiling that cost more per square foot than her old apartment's monthly rent, still in yesterday's dress because she had fallen asleep before she'd figured out the buttons and took a slow inventory of her life. Age 26. Occupation. Now legally Mrs. Blackwell, which was not a job description she had any training for. So status. Married to a man who had dismissed her like a quarterly memo, and then, this was the part she kept returning to, looked at her just once, like she was.
If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more amazing love stories. All right, back to the story.
Something he recognized from a long time ago. She pressed her fingers to her sternum and told herself that meant nothing. Then she got up, found a complimentary robe in the closet, and went looking for coffee. The suite's main kitchen was empty, but the coffee was already made. A full pot, still warm, was sitting on the counter next to a single clean mug. And next to the mug, a folded piece of hotel stationery with 2 words written in sharp, slanted handwriting, cream, left cabinet. Kimberly stood there in her robe and her rumpled hair and stared at those 2 words for an embarrassingly long time. It wasn't kindness exactly. It was more like efficiency. Like he had noticed a logistical gap and addressed it. Like she was a variable he had accounted for. She opened the left cabinet. Cream. Also sugar. Also, inexplicably, a small sleeve of the specific brand of shortbread cookies she had mentioned to his assistant 3 weeks ago when they were coordinating the sweet details. She poured her coffee. She stood at the counter and ate a shortbread cookie at 7 in the morning in her wedding dress in a hotel robe. And she thought, well, he's paying attention to something. She didn't see Richard until nearly 9. She had changed by then. She'd had the presence of mind to pack an overnight bag, unlike her dress situation, and was sitting at the dining table with her laptop, emails open, trying to remember that she had a life outside of this marble tower. She was a freelance interior designer, had been for 3 years, and her clients did not particularly care that she had gotten married the day before. Mrs. Okafor needed her kitchen mood board by Friday. That was a fact that existed independent of everything else. She heard the soft sound of wheels on marble before she saw him. Richard came around the corner from the main bedroom, showered, changed, wearing a dark charcoal shirt with the sleeves folded to the elbows and dark trousers, his hair slightly damp. He moved through the suite with a practiced ease that she suspected took years of quiet, furious effort to achieve. The kind of ease that isn't natural, but becomes natural through sheer refusal to be anything else. He stopped when he saw her at the table. "You're working," he said. Not a question. Slightly, fractionally, a surprise. "Mrs. Okafor needs a kitchen mood board." She didn't look up immediately. "She's been waiting 2 weeks and I've been a little busy." A pause. "You're a designer." "Interior. Freelance. Mostly residential, some commercial." Now she looked up. "Your people did a background check on me. It was in the file." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite discomfort, but adjacent to it. "I didn't read the file." She blinked. "Oh, my attorney compiled it." He moved toward the kitchen, the motion economical and smooth. "I read the contract." There was something so purely Richard Blackwell about that sentence that Kimberly almost laughed. Almost. "Of course you did," she said, and returned to her laptop. She heard him pour coffee. They heard him, after a moment's pause, come back toward the dining area and stop at the far end of the table, a careful distance away, setting his mug down and opening his own laptop with the focused quiet of a man who had never in his life done anything without intention. They worked in silence for 40 minutes. It was, surprisingly, not unbearable. His name was Richard Alistair Blackwell, and before the accident, he had been the kind of man that rooms reorganized themselves around. Not loudly. Richard had never been loud, but there was a quality to him, a particular density of presence, that made people straighten slightly when he walked in, made conversations quiet by a few degrees, made other men in expensive suits suddenly aware of their own inadequacy. He had built his father's floundering real estate firm into a $4.2 billion empire by the time he was 31, largely through a combination of surgical intelligence and a tolerance for risk that his CFO privately described as medically concerning. He had also, before the accident, been engaged. Her name was Victoria. She had lasted 6 weeks after the crash, before deciding with the kind of pragmatic grace that Richard might have admired under different circumstances, that this was not the life she had signed up for. She had returned the ring. She had sent flowers to the hospital. She had not come back. Richard had not asked her to. That was the thing about him that most people misread as coldness. He never asked for anything. Not help, not comfort, not the ordinary human allowance of being witnessed in pain. He had rebuilt his professional life from a hospital bed, and then a rehabilitation center, and then a home office, and then, gradually, ruthlessly, back into the boardroom, and he had done all of it without once letting anyone see the cost. What the accident had taken from him was his legs. What he had quietly, voluntarily surrendered afterward was everything else. And then his father, in the last weeks of his life, had called in a favor from an old friend named Daniel Moore. "Richard needs something to live for," the elder Blackwell had apparently said, which Richard found both mortifying and, in his most private moments, terrifyingly accurate. Daniel Moore had a daughter. And now that daughter was sitting at the other end of his dining table eating shortbread cookies and designing someone's kitchen, and she had told him last night, with no trembling, no performance, just plain and direct, that she wasn't afraid of him. He kept thinking about that. He looked up from his screen and watched her for a moment. The way she tilted her head when she was studying a color swatch, the small line that appeared between her brows when something wasn't quite right, and the way she tucked one foot up under herself in the chair without seeming to notice she'd done it. She looked like someone who was entirely used to being comfortable in her own skin. He had forgotten what that looked like. He dropped his gaze back to his screen before she could catch him. His younger sister arrived at 11 with overnight bags and a complete absence of social awareness. "Okay, and I brought croissants." Naomi Blackwell announced herself by letting herself in with the spare key card she had apparently acquired through means that Richard did not want to examine, dropping an enormous tote bag on the entryway table and unwinding a bright yellow scarf from around her neck. She was 28, worked in fashion PR, and had never once in her life entered a room at a reasonable volume. And also, I need to see the bride immediately, Rich. Where is she? I've been dying. She spotted Kimberly at the dining table and stopped. Then she broke into a smile so warm and immediate that Kimberly instinctively sat up straighter, charmed against her will. Oh, she's pretty, Naomi said, to no one in particular. Rich, she's so pretty. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't tell you anything about her, Richard said without looking up. You found out from Mom. Because you told Mom nothing. Naomi crossed to the dining table with her croissant bag and deposited herself in the chair across from Kimberly with the energy of a golden retriever who had just spotted a new best friend. Hi, I'm Naomi. I'm the better sibling. Don't let him tell you otherwise. He hasn't told me much of anything, Kimberly said. Naomi turned and looked at Richard with an expression of theatrical suffering. Unbelievable. Well, you didn't even warn her. About what? About yourself. Richard closed his laptop with a quiet click. Kimberly, he said calmly, my sister has no boundaries and will ask you personal questions within the first 7 minutes. I'd recommend giving her approximately 40% of the truth. She'll construct the rest, Naomi gasped. Kimberly laughed, actually laughed, surprised out of it. And Richard glanced at her when she did, just briefly. Something about the sound of it seemed to catch him off guard. He looked away. Naomi stayed for 2 hours, and in that time managed to extract Kimberly's entire design portfolio, her opinion on Richard's apartment decor, cold but the bones are extraordinary, her coffee order, her feelings about the Upper West Side, when and the general outline of how she and Richard had met, which Kimberly narrated diplomatically as, our fathers were old friends, and Naomi received with the knowing look of someone who had already read the full chapter. She did not ask about the marriage contract. She did not ask about the accident. She did, as she was leaving, pull Kimberly into a hug that was startlingly warm and hold on for just a moment longer than expected and say quietly, close to her ear, he's not as far away as he seems. I just thought you should know. Kimberly didn't say anything. She stood in the entryway after Naomi left and looked at the closed door for a long moment. Then she turned around and found Richard watching her from the hallway, just watching, still his expression unreadable. And they looked at each other across the length of the suite, and neither of them said a word. And somehow that was more than everything else combined. The contract had a clause. Kimberly found it on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into the marriage, while she was looking for the internet password in the folder of household documents Richard's attorney had left on the kitchen counter of the Blackwell penthouse, which was where she now lived because apparently that was her life. The penthouse was on the 58th floor of a building in Midtown that Richard owned, along with 4 others just like it. It was the kind of apartment that appeared in architecture magazines under headlines like, When Minimalism Becomes Theology. All clean lines and cool neutrals and floor-to-ceiling glass, every surface deliberate, nothing soft anywhere. Except she had noticed a single worn paperback on the nightstand in Richard's room that she had glimpsed once through the open door and never mentioned. She had been given the guest suite. It had a view of the Hudson and a closet that was frankly offensive in its generosity. She was slowly, quietly making it hers. A throw blanket here, a small plant there, a row of design books on the shelf. Tiny acts of occupation, she told herself, were purely practical. She was not thinking about the fact that she could hear him moving through the apartment at night. She was not thinking about how the coffee was always made before she woke up. She was absolutely not thinking about the 11 seconds in the hotel suite when he had looked at her like he was trying to remember the name of something he had lost. She was looking for the internet password, and she found the clause. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Blackwell-Moore marriage contract. For the arrangement to remain valid and binding, including all associated financial protections, inheritance provisions, weigh-in property transfers. Both parties must reside together in the primary Blackwell residence for a minimum of 12 consecutive months and must make reasonable public appearances as a married couple no fewer than once per calendar month for a period of no less than 1 year from the date of the marriage. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor, which she recognized was not her most dignified moment, and read it a third time. Public appearances as a married couple. Once a month. She and Richard had, in 3 weeks of cohabitation, developed a system. A careful, functional, mutually respectful system in which they occupied the same extraordinary apartment, the way two very polite strangers might share a first-class cabin on a very long flight, aware of each other, occasionally civil, never quite touching. He worked from his home office until 2 or 3 in the afternoon, then left for the Blackwell Group headquarters. She worked from the dining table, and they ate dinner in the same room approximately 4 times a week, which had evolved from a tense logistical accident into something that was almost, possibly, a habit. He had started asking about her projects, not warmly, not with any particular softness. More the way a person might ask about the weather, factual interest, minimal exposure. How did the Okafor kitchen present? What's the turnaround on a commercial project that size? But he asked, and she answered. And sometimes the conversation ran longer than either of them seemed to intend. It was not nothing, and now she was going to have to tell him she'd found the clause, because she suspected, strongly, that he didn't know she hadn't read the contract. She brought it up that evening. He was in his office when she knocked. The door half open, the room lit by the blue-white glow of 3 monitors. Financial documents layered across his desk in the particular organized chaos that she learned was actually a highly specific filing system that no one else was allowed to touch. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. He had a pen behind his ear, which was such an unexpectedly human detail that she almost forgot what she'd come to say. "I found Section 7, she said. A pause. He set down the document in his hand. "Ah, you knew I hadn't read it." He didn't deny it. "Yeah, I assumed you'd find it eventually." "Were you going to tell me?" "Yes." He said it simply, without defensiveness. "I was determining how." She leaned against the doorframe and looked at him across the room, this careful, composed, infuriating man, and decided to be equally direct. 12 months. Monthly appearances. What does that mean, practically? Richard folded his hands on the desk. It means events, business dinners, occasionally charity functions or industry gatherings. Nothing that requires more than an evening. With you. You are my wife. In contract. The contract, he said quietly, is what determines the inheritance your father left in trust for you, which I assume you prefer to keep. That landed. She breathed through it. Right. A silence that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely uncomfortable either. The specific silence that had started developing between them, layered and warm at the edges, in a way she was carefully not examining. "The first one is this Friday," Richard said. She straightened. "This Friday. The Harrove Foundation Gala. Black tie. I've attended every year since 2019 and skipped the last 2. He paused. Something moved briefly across his expression. Not quite discomfort, more like the memory of discomfort, well managed. "It would be noticed if I attended and you weren't there." She thought about that. About walking into a glittering room full of New York's most precisely groomed and quietly judgmental people on the arm, beside the wheelchair, of a man who hadn't looked at her directly in 4 days. "Okay," she said. He looked up. He'd clearly expected more resistance. "Okay," he repeated. "I'm a professional, Richard. I can attend a gala." She pushed off the doorframe. "I'll need to know the dress code parameters. And I'll need you to brief me on anyone I absolutely cannot accidentally offend." She was almost back down the hall when she heard him say, quietly, and she almost missed it under the sound of the city 40 floors below. "The pen is still behind your ear." She stopped. She reached up. There was, in fact, a pen behind her ear. She had picked it up off the counter this morning and apparently forgotten about it for 6 hours. She heard, and this was new. This was entirely new. A sound from his office that was low and brief and could only be described as a laugh. Quickly suppressed, immediately retracted, but undeniably real. She walked back to her room, with her heart doing something completely unreasonable. Friday arrived with the specific cruelty of important days that refuse to give you time to prepare emotionally. Kimberly stood in front of her mirror at 6:45 in a gown she had borrowed from a designer client. Deep burgundy, silk charmeuse, one shoulder, skimming the floor in a way that was elegant without being bridal, which felt like an important distinction tonight. She had done her own hair and makeup because she was stubborn and also because she was good at it. She looked, she decided, like a woman who belonged in rooms like this. Whether she felt like one was a separate question. She came down the hall at 7 to find Richard already in the entryway. He was in a black tuxedo, perfectly fitted, white shirt, no tie, the collar open by one button in a way that managed to look less casual than intensely intentional. He had his phone in one hand and was reading something, and he didn't hear her immediately, and she had approximately 3 full seconds to observe him without his composure aimed at her. He looked, she thought, like grief that had learned to dress well. Then he looked up. His eyes moved over her once, measured, and careful, and something shifted in his expression that he controlled almost immediately. Almost. "You look," he started. "Presentable?" she offered. "I was going to say formidable." She felt that word move through her chest like warm water. "Well," she said, picking up her clutch, "let's go be married in public." The Harrove Gala was held in the grand ballroom of the St. Regis, and it was exactly as gleaming and precisely peopled as Kimberly had anticipated. For 300 of New York's finest, in varying degrees of black tie, an orchestra playing something from the 30s, waiters moving through the crowd with champagne flutes like they'd rehearsed it, which, knowing events like this, they had. The moment they entered, she felt it. The shift in the room, the subtle redirecting of attention. Not toward her, toward him. Richard Blackwell back in the room, first public appearance in 2 years. And the woman beside him that no one had been expecting. She stood straight. She smiled with the practiced warmth she had developed through years of client presentations and let the room look. Richard leaned slightly toward her. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. And said very quietly, "Hargrove, 12 o'clock. He'll kiss your hand and compliment your gown." "We'll let him. Is he important?" "He chairs the board that approves our Hudson Yards development." "Got it." She turned her smile up by precisely the right amount as a silver-haired man in a burgundy cummerbund materialized before them. "Mr. Hargrove, what a magnificent event." From beside her, Richard was quiet, but she felt his attention on her like a second presence. She worked the room, because that was the only way to describe it, with a fluency she didn't know she had until she was inside it. She learned names, connected faces to the briefings Richard murmured to her between conversations, remembered wives and asked about children, and said exactly the right appreciative things about the ballroom's lighting, while privately clocking that whoever had designed the floral arrangements had a heavy hand with the white lilies. At some point she registered that Richard was watching her more than he was engaging with the room. At some point she registered that she had stopped noticing his wheelchair entirely, not because she was ignoring it, but because it had simply become part of how he moved, how he occupied space, how he held himself with that particular still authority that made people lean toward him when he spoke. At some point, during a lull between conversations, he handed her a glass of water, not champagne. He'd clearly noticed she wasn't drinking, without being asked. "You're good at this," he said. She glanced at him. "I'm an interior designer. My entire job is reading a room and making it feel like it was built for you." He looked at her steadily. "That's not something you learn. That's something you are." She had no safe response to that, so she looked away, at the glittering ballroom, at all the curated people performing their curated lives. And she thought about her father who had made her promise, and about the second bedroom, and about the sound of a laugh that had lasted less than a second. And she thought, "I am in a great deal of trouble." They didn't speak much on the ride home. The car moved through Midtown in the particular late-night quiet that Manhattan occasionally offered like a gift, and Kimberly watched the city through the window and felt the day sitting heavy and warm in her chest. At some point, she became aware that Richard was watching her reflection in the glass. She didn't turn. Neither did he. They rode the elevator up in silence, and at the door to her suite, she stopped and turned and found him closer than she'd expected. Not close, not inappropriate, just present. in a way he usually wasn't. His pale eyes in the low light of the corridor were doing the thing she was trying to stop cataloging. That thing where they seemed to hold more than his face allowed. You didn't have to carry any of that," he said. "Tonight, I would have managed." She looked at him. "I know you would have." She paused. "That's not why I did it." He was quiet for a moment. "Why then?" She thought about the contract, about Section 7, about her father's voice with the oxygen mask and the tears, and he just forgot how. "Because," she said softly, "I think you've been managing alone long enough." She went inside. She closed the door. And on the other side, she pressed her back against it and closed her eyes and told herself firmly and without any real conviction, this is still just a contract. It started with the plants. Kimberly had, over the course of 4 weeks, introduced 7 plants into the Blackwell penthouse. She had done this gradually and without announcement, the way you might introduce a shy animal into a new environment. One at a time, nothing dramatic, placed with the careful intention of someone who understood space for a living. A trailing pothos on the kitchen shelf, a fiddle leaf fig near the living room window, 2 small succulents on the dining table that she rotated toward the light every few days with the focused tenderness of a woman who had decided, quietly and without making a speech about it, that something in this apartment was going to be alive. Richard said nothing about the plants for 11 days. On the 12th day, she came home from a client meeting to find the fiddle leaf fig had been moved, repositioned approximately 14 inches to the left, directly into the strongest band of afternoon light that came through the west-facing window. A spot she hadn't tried because she'd assumed the angle was wrong. The fig looked, frankly, magnificent. She stood in the living room in her coat and her work bag and stared at the fig for a long moment. Then she went to the kitchen. One poured 2 cups of coffee the way she'd learned. They both took it and carried one down the hall to Richard's office. She knocked once and set it on the corner of his desk without a word. He looked up from his screen. She looked at him. Neither of them mentioned the plant, but something shifted, some quiet mutual acknowledgement that this was now something they were doing, paying attention to the small things, to each other. What neither of them said out loud was that this was the most careful either of them had ever been with another person. The routine built itself the way routines do, not by design but by repetition, each small thing becoming a thread until one day you notice you're holding something woven. Mornings, coffee made, always before she woke. She had stopped pretending this was accidental. She had started leaving a shortbread cookie on the counter next to his mug, in which she was aware was deeply transparent and had chosen to do anyway. Afternoons, she worked from the dining table, he from his office, and somewhere around 2 o'clock, one of them would surface and the other would become aware of it. And there was a period of overlap, 20 minutes, sometimes 40, where they occupied the kitchen at the same time, talking about nothing in particular. Her clients, his development projects, a documentary she'd watched the night before. We're in a building in the West Village he'd acquired in 2019 that had a design problem he'd never quite solved. That last conversation lasted 2 hours. She hadn't noticed until she looked up and the light had changed. Evenings, dinner, more often than not. He had started ordering from restaurants, she mentioned in passing, not commenting on it, just arriving home with containers from the Thai place she'd described 3 days ago, or the Italian spot whose garlic bread she had apparently praised with enough specificity to constitute a recommendation. She had started cooking on the nights she was home early, not because she'd agreed to or because the contract suggested it, but because the kitchen was beautiful and she was good at it, and there was something about cooking in a space while being aware of someone in the next room that felt, on against all reason, like companionship. The first time she cooked, he appeared in the kitchen doorway and observed the situation with an expression of mild surprise. "You're cooking," he said. "Pasta," she said. "The carbonara kind. It'll be ready in 20. He looked at the pan, at the organized spread of ingredients, at her in a rust-colored linen shirt and dark jeans, hair twisted up with a pencil through it, the pen situation having apparently become a signature. "I didn't know you cooked," he said. "You didn't read the file," she reminded him. He made a sound, not quite a laugh, but first cousin to one, and went to set the table without being asked. She stirred the pasta and told herself her heart rate was elevated because of the heat from the stove. The night it changed, the night the slow ache of all this became undeniable. It started with a thunderstorm. New York in October had no interest in being subtle, and the storm came in off the Atlantic fast and mean. And by 9 o'clock, the windows were sheeted with rain, and the city had disappeared entirely behind a gray wall of weather. And the penthouse felt, for the first time since she'd moved in, small, intimate, like the storm had pressed the walls gently inward. Richard was in the living room when she came in from her bedroom, drawn by the sound of the rain. He was by the window. Of course he was. He was always drawn to windows. She'd noticed that early and cataloged it without meaning to. A book open in his lap, the lamp beside him casting him in amber, the storm raging silently on the other side of the glass. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "I don't sleep much." He said it without self-pity, just as fact. "You. The storm." She came in, tucking herself into the corner of the large sectional, with her knees drawn up, or pulling a throw blanket over herself, the soft charcoal one she'd introduced 3 weeks ago, that had migrated from her room to the living room, without either of them acknowledging it. "I like storms. I just can't sleep through them." He looked back at the window. "My father used to say that storms were the city exhaling." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know much about your father. Mine didn't talk about him often. They were close when they were young. Business school." A pause. Less close after my father became the kind of man my father became." She turned her head toward him. "What kind of man was that?" Richard considered the question with the careful seriousness he applied to everything. Successful, demanding, not always present in the ways that mattered. He turned a page of his book without reading it. "He loved us. I never doubted that. He just expressed it primarily through provision, which is a specific love language that takes a while to appreciate." She thought about her own father, about a man who had made her school lunches until she was 17 and cried at her college graduation and spent his last coherent weeks ensuring she would be taken care of. "Mine expressed it through being there," she said softly. "He was just always there. Every school play and failed driving test and terrible first date." She smiled at the rain. He would have found this whole situation either hilarious or deeply satisfying, probably both. She felt Richard looking at her. "You miss him," he said, not a question. "Every day." She pulled the blanket tighter. "Does it get easier, losing a parent?" She looked at him. "Your mother mentioned your father's been gone 3 years." Something moved across Richard's face, unhurried and unguarded, in a way she'd only seen a handful of times. "It changes," he said carefully. "It becomes less present, but it doesn't get easier exactly. You just get stronger than it, eventually." She nodded. She looked at the rain. After a moment, he said, "My father arranged this marriage because he thought I'd stop trying." She looked at him. "Trying to what?" "To be in the world." He said it without drama, looking at his book, his voice low and even. "After the accident, after Victoria." A pause. He wasn't wrong. The name, Victoria, landed between them. She didn't ask, and he wasn't offering, but something about him saying it, about the brief flatness in his voice when he did, told her more than a full explanation would have. "And now?" she asked quietly. He was silent for a moment. Then he looked at her, fully the way he had on their wedding night, the way he did when he forgot to protect himself, and said nothing, and somehow that was the loudest answer she'd ever heard. "Now," his eyes said, "there's you." She looked away first. She had to. So the storm pressed against the glass. The lamp made everything amber. Her heart was doing the thing again, the completely unreasonable thing, and she was running out of architecture to hide it behind. "I should try to sleep," she said. She didn't move immediately. "Kimberly," she looked at him. "The pasta last Tuesday," he said. "It was the best thing I've eaten in 2 years." It was such a Richard Blackwell compliment. Factual, precise, emotionally enormous and expressly delivered as a food review, that she felt her chest crack open a little. "It's the pancetta," she said, equally serious. People skip the pancetta. He nodded gravely. I'll note that. She stood up. She folded the blanket. She was almost to the hallway when she stopped and turned back and found him watching her, as she'd known he would be. Richard, she said. He waited. I'm glad your father did this. She held his gaze. When I know that's not. I know this is complicated. But I'm glad. He said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, and it cost him something. She could see it cost him something. So am I. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the rain and thought about pale gray eyes in amber light and a man who moved the fiddle leaf fig 14 inches and called her pasta the best thing he'd eaten in 2 years. And she thought, I am not falling. And then, I have already fallen. And there was a morning 2 weeks after the storm that she would return to later as the moment she understood what they were becoming. She was at the dining table with fabric samples spread across half the surface, trying to solve a particularly stubborn problem with a client's living room. The light was wrong for the warm tones, but the cool tones flattened the space, and she was stuck in the particular creative purgatory of knowing what wasn't working without yet seeing what would. Richard came out of his office, earlier than usual, which she noticed, poured coffee and stopped behind her chair. What's the problem, he said. Light direction, she said, not looking up. This room faces north. Everything warm reads orange by afternoon, and everything cool disappears. I can't find the middle. He was quiet for a moment. She felt him leaning slightly, looking at the samples over her shoulder. The Harrove East Wing had that problem, he said. 2021 renovation. If the designer used a warm gray, pulled from the cooler side of the warm spectrum, neutralized both issues. She looked up at him. He was very close, closer than he usually got in the daylight, in the ordinary business of the apartment. And for a moment neither of them moved, his hand resting on the back of her chair, her face tilted up toward his, the morning light falling across both of them. She reached for the sample she thought he meant. Their hands met over the fan of fabric swatches, and not dramatically, not like a scene, just his fingers and hers briefly on a square of warm gray wool, and a pause that lasted 1 second longer than accidental. He moved his hand first. She looked back at the samples. That one, she said, voice steady by sheer professional commitment. You're right. I usually am, he said. She could hear, without looking, that he was almost smiling. She pressed her lips together to hold back her own smile and made a note in her design file and told herself this was fine. This was completely fine. It was not fine. Dearest viewers, what happens next in this very interesting story? Stay tuned as we bring you the part 2 of the story,